There are 6 billion plus of us here now. We're talking more often, more frequently, and more regularly than ever. You don't believe that? Here are some people who are proof. Ben Ali, in Tunisia, his wife and family, thrown out after one angry man begins to fight back, who's immediately memorialized on social media, leading to hundreds of thousands of protesters, and then finally, generations of rule ended. It spreads like wildfire, heading east to a regime that has been there for over 30 years. President Mubarak, his son, heir apparent. Initial outcry at first, leading to mass demonstrations. Soon millions gather, brought together by social media, brought together by people using Twitter, Facebook, urging themselves to get organized, to rise up against the authority. It happens, preposterously, incredibly. What couldn't have been foreseen happens. Mubarak leaves. Where will it end? Who can say? Algeria? Libya? Syria? Jordan? Oman? Yemen? Bahrain? The House of Saud itself? Brian Spooner, a professor of anthropology at Penn, has studied this. We are going to talk about it. We're going to take your views too. Good afternoon. My name is Frank Fortunato. I'm a recent graduate of the master's program, Master's of Liberal Arts program at the University of Pennsylvania, and a businessman in Princeton, New Jersey. We're here in Philadelphia today. We're in the office of Professor Brian Spooner. Professor Spooner is a professor of anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the chair of the Penn Faculty Forum on Globalization. Professor Spooner's offices are in the world-renowned Penn University Museum. Several short steps from where we are right now are Egyptian mummies and a whole host of antiquities, actually. It's quite an impressive facility. We're here today to talk to the professor about a pilot program that we're launching that's going to discuss the issue of globalization, the history of it, and its effects today on the modern world. Globalization is a subject that's little understood by people. Perhaps that's because nobody's taken the time to think about it. Professor Spooner has thought a great deal about it, and I thank him for inviting us today to his office. Professor, how are you? Welcome. Thank you for this.
Thank you for making this effort.
It's certainly our pleasure. Why don't you perhaps tell us a little bit, with a little bit of an overview as to globalization today, 2011. I mean, what does it mean just simply beyond the newspaper headline? And talk a little bit about how it evolved into an actual subject of study.
Well, we've developed a group here of people who feel that the study of globalization so far has been carried out less comprehensively than is necessary. That is, when you read about globalization, you read what's happening in economics or what's happening in politics and what's happening in a particular part of the world. You tend to hear about what American things are spreading to other parts of the world and less about what things are spreading from other parts of the world into America. And we want to develop a perspective on globalization that takes account of everything and makes sense of it. And in order to do that, we've got to get a lot of different people that can represent different points of view and interact with each other in a sympathetic way, ready to learn from each other and work out how to put things together.
What is a poor man's definition of globalization? When we're talking about globalization, what do we mean when we say that?
There are a lot of poor men's definitions of globalization, and we're trying to get...
Let's do it moderately means.
We're trying to get beyond them and represent globalization in an interactive process in such a way that anybody can come and listen to a bit of the discussion and get something out of it and understand better how the world is changing. But the problem with the study of globalization is that everybody tends to be taken by the heading globalization and assume that they're looking at the whole world. But if you can't look at the whole world, or you can't look only at things that are spreading to the whole world. So we've been talking about the fading of the distance factor, the fact that everything's getting closer and closer together. But that sort of definition, and there are plenty of other definitions of that type, seems to us to be a consequence of what's really happening. And we've somehow got to get underneath these superficial things that get talked about, the fact that you can get from A to B faster now than you ever could before, and that Sheratons are everywhere and other things that are signs that globalization is happening, and try to work out what's actually driving it. Because after all, economics measures and counts, but what it measures and counts are what people do, and economics doesn't really explain why people make the decisions that they make that creates the economic processes. So the answer to this problem that we've developed so far has to do with the increasing amount of interaction in the world as a whole, and the fact that it gets the level of interaction becomes more intense in particular places, and that intensity spreads. So the whole process of that underlies globalization is uneven, and it's true that it started to spread from the West, and at some point in maybe future sessions of these discussions we'll get into this in more detail, but the point is that in the last 50 years, especially since the Second World War, there's been a noticeable increase in the rate at which these things are spreading, and that's why China is now becoming the dominant power in large parts of the world, where America was the dominant power a generation ago.
Let me back into this a little bit. So, based on that discussion, globalization itself is not new. You can go back to the days when the citizenry was living in villages separated by great distances, and somebody brought a wife in from a different village, and they came into the husband's village, and then her family would come in from time to time. Those interactions were brought in, they were new, they weren't happening before. People exchanged ideas. At a very low level then, globalization was occurring. It's always been occurring. But since the end of the Second World War, I think I know the obvious answers, what has increased this trajectory so much? These interactions?
Well, the increase in population has increased the trajectory. I mean, you can start the story of globalization as far back as you want to for any particular question that you have about it. In fact, one person who invented the idea of big history starts the story of globalization with the Big Bang, and it's perfectly, it makes good sense to do that in some ways. But of course, starting with the appearance of our species makes, I suppose, more sense for most people. And that's interesting because we're probably the first, almost certainly the first species in biological evolution to become a single community as a single species. We're not yet, but it looks as though when globalization reaches a certain stage, every member of our species will be a member of one single global community.
So interactions, just to try to narrow it down so I can understand how it projects out. For example, in a small office environment of 15 or so people, if 2 or 3 new people are hired, begin to come in with different points of view, different ways of doing things, those ways ultimately begin to have an effect, positive or negatively, on the people who are working there originally. Perhaps their favorite restaurants might be introduced to the existing people, perhaps their favorite baseball teams, whatever. But on a more societally strict order, don't these interactions pose a threat to established cultures and societal structures in some areas of the world? And I'm thinking of, for example, the Islamic countries that have fairly well-defined social structures based upon the community practicing of their religion. How does globalization bump into existing structures? Does it fit around it nicely, or is it an encounter that is fraught with some peril? Or, I mean, that's a very broad question.
Interesting question. Globalization is not a smooth process.
Mm-hmm.
It sometimes moves ahead fast, and sometimes gets into difficulties, and conflicts break out, and it appears as though the process is in reverse, but in fact conflict in the longer run hastens globalization because it disrupts established ways of doing things,
mm-hmm.
and people have to work out new ways of doing things when the old ways are disrupted. So in the end, even though conflict is unfortunate and usually bad for many people, when the conflict is over, you find that you're a level ahead from where you were before. The more people who interact with each other, the greater the rate of change is likely to be, because people learn from each other when they interact. But the trouble is, if you see a lot of people interacting over there and they're not inviting you, then you tend to interact with other people against those people.
That's right.
Or at least that's the sort of thing that happens, reducing it to very simple terms. And that's obviously what's happening between Islam and the West today. But the reasons that that is happening are quite complicated, and they have to do with the fact that since the 1970s there has been an increasing reaction against the heritage of the colonial period. And the only banner people have had to line up behind in order to try to combat what they see as neo-colonial influence has been Islam.
Mm-hmm.
So really, Islam gets a bad press as a religion, but it has nothing to do with the religion at all. It has to do with the fact that people need something to give them an identity. And then in order to reinforce that identity, they look to the religion, mm-hmm. and pick things out of that which they think will insulate them against, mm-hmm. Western influence.
Western influence in this case being change.
Well, yes, Western influence brings about change, and of course it's unfortunate also that one of the things that is most visible in change in Western society at the moment is gender relations,
right.
and attitudes, right. towards sex, reproduction, and so on, mm-hmm. and the family, who lives together in a single household, that sort of thing. And Islam has always been based first and foremost on the sanctity of the family. So mm-hmm. Any spread of Western influence is seen as a direct threat to mm-hmm. established ways of doing things in the Islamic world. Mm-hmm. So that's why we have this particular problem, which is nevertheless very much a stage on the globalization process.
So in a funny way, the way after, for example, the Congress of Vienna and individual countries in Europe began to gradually develop embryonic seeds of nationalism, what's happening today is there's a type of globalism that could be said to be occurring. Is the genie out of the bottle here? I mean, once and for all? I mean, I suppose we could ask this question to the people in Tahrir Square who have been there for 16 days in a row. I mean, the genie is really out of the bottle. And this can't go back. I mean, unless we go into a mandatory agrarian economy around the world with no urban centers and no phones and no internet.
Well, we're moving into an urbanized world where, I mean, already over half the population of the world lives in cities, and we reckon it might be 75% within 50 years from now. And that means that people who don't live in cities will nevertheless be governed from cities and essentially be part of an urban environment, because very soon you won't have to live in a city spatially in order to be part of urban interaction.
Right.
All these things are difficult to narrow down and talk about one at a time, but the whole idea of nation is a Western idea, and we have imposed it on the rest of the world through the United Nations, which we designed in the late 40s, and told everybody that if you want to belong to the United Nations, they had to identify themselves as a nation. But in fact, most of the members of the United Nations are simply territories which the West defined and told that they had to organize their populations as nations, and that worked for a while, or it worked well enough for us to think that it was working, and now we can see that it's beginning not to work. But Egypt and Tahrir Square and Cairo, I think, is a sign of the consequences in the modern world of the increased intensity of interaction among more and more people. Now the population has grown, and Egypt is 80 million people, whereas 100 years ago it was about a quarter of that. And it's this, cities are getting out of, governments can no longer control what goes on in cities. Global cities interact more with each other than with their governments. But that is, a large proportion of the population of what we call global cities are more concerned about what's going on in other cities than what's going on in their own country and what their government is trying to get them to do. So we still need governments, because governments are in the business of providing infrastructure in particular territories, but they're getting left behind in the process of social change.
Let me ask this as a teaser as we bring this first session to a close. We talked about culture, we talked briefly about Islam, we talked about society, and we'll talk much more about each of them in depth. But let's say, for example, I was the CEO of a Fortune 50 company, say General Electric, Jeffrey Immelt, with 70 or 80% of his corporate revenue dependent upon outside the U.S. sources. Certainly, he's been aware of globalization insofar as it represents a commercial attractiveness for investment, for earning more money. Would this be time for business to begin to think of an expansion of their understanding of this? I mean, how can anybody with investment, for example, in Egypt or the Arab world or anywhere else, look at what, for example, is happening in Tahrir Square and not get a chill down their spine, just wondering, oh man, maybe we should become more aware of this? And how is this going to interact? I mean, I know this is a little bit of a left field question, but I mean, should we?
I think
are we at the point now where these big companies should, as much as they're using risk modelers, should they add in a couple of globalization experts?
I think there are two ways to answer this question, and ideally we need both of the answers. And one is that the social change that is spreading throughout the world, which is making situations like what we see in Tahrir Square possible, is business has to keep up with it. And the way business is conducted and the way corporations are organized is changing. But it may not be changing fast enough. The way that it's changing is in terms of flexibility. And flexibility is a mark of so much of what can be identified as change in the modern world. But there are always going to be breakdowns in security. And so multinational corporations are going to have to be ready to cope with breakdowns in security at any time.
I'm thinking of the Google executive who was just released in Egypt.
Well, that's a wonderful example.
It certainly is, yeah.
But also, I understand that Nokia is about to come out with a significant announcement of complete reorganization, probably at the end of this week. Because it's got caught between Google and
Facebook?
yeah, and has to do something, and obviously because it's got caught and sees its way to complete reorganization, gets an opportunity to jump ahead.
Okay.
And so it's like there is insecurity in business all the time, and we try to pretend that there isn't insecurity in society all the time. We try to keep it under covers. But I think if people in positions of authority in business get used to the idea of change and the way things are changing and what comes with change, then they will be able to cope with the unpredictability and flexibility that is coming in the way society changes.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to an extensive and increased dialogue on this topic. So,
Okay.
thank you very much, and we will return shortly with another program for your viewing.